Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Niskanen Center's event on the future of remote work and housing. My name is Ted Gayer, and as of very recently, this past 2 months ago, August 1st, I am the new president of the Niskanen Center. For those of you who are unfamiliar with us, our mission is to restore faith in democratic institutions by helping them govern effectively. We pursue this mission using the principles of a free and open society, and by leveraging what we call around here transpartisanship. Transpartisanship draws on the best ideas of the left and right and starts with somewhat of a simple premise that an innovative private sector and a capable public sector are mutually dependent. Thanks to the support from the Conrad and Hilton Foundation and also from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, we have recently extended our transpartisan approach to housing policy by adding Alex Armlovich and Andrew Justice to our team. With them, we can advance the ideas to increase housing supply, such as by reforming regulatory zoning and land use policies. Our goal is to provide national level leadership to local pro-housing advocates and to share the best ideas from across the YIMBY movement. Today, we will explore how the dramatic shift towards working from home could offer opportunities to address housing shortages. And it indeed has been a dramatic shift. We've all experienced this. Pre-pandemic, less than 5% of paid workdays were from home, and now it's about 30%. To just take one little tidbit from that, this translates to about 200 million hours of commuting time saved each week. The future of remote and hybrid work is very much on my mind, especially its effects on the labor market, and also from where I sit as someone who leads an organization still trying to figure out how we can work most effectively in this new environment. But it also has dramatic effects on things like commercial real estate, public transportation, and residential housing supply. So today, among other things, we will explore the opportunities that remote and hybrid work can present to city planners and policymakers to address housing supply shortages. I am delighted that Niskanen Senior Fellow Matt Iglesias will lead this conversation. Among other things, he's the co-founder of Vox and is the author of the fantastic Substack Slow Boring. He is also a frequent and forceful champion of increasing housing abundance, most notably in his 2012 ebook, The Rent is Too Damn High. This book really shifted the housing debate from almost an exclusive focus on demand-side policies to highlighting the importance of increasing supply as a solution to housing affordability. So thank you, Matt, for joining us and for moderating this session. And with that, I'll turn it over to you to introduce the speakers and to get us started. Thanks.
Fantastic. So thank you so much, Ted. I'm really excited to be here, help launch this new team. On behalf of our colleagues here, I want to thank our panelists. We've got Adam Ozimek, Daryl Fairweather, and our own Alex Armlovich. And I also, of course, want to thank the audience for joining us today. Anybody who's here has probably been to a lot of housing, future of work kind of panels. A lot of that's been focusing on the perils that cities face, which are obviously real. It's a time of transition. It's a time of risk. It's a time of difficulty, but it's not as simple as a peril. Remote and hybrid work are different from one another, and at least one of our panelists is going to argue that hybrid work might be really good for cities. And in general, America's cities face a mix of threats and opportunities. Housing market outcomes depend not only on the future of white-collar work, but how exactly that future arrives is going to make a big difference, and how policymakers respond to shifting patterns of demand is going to make a big difference. So we hope you can take away a deeper understanding of the nuanced differences between these different scenarios, what cities and policymakers need to do about it. So all of our speakers here have some long, impressive CVs, but for the sake of brevity, we've got links posted to complete bios in the chat. But very briefly, Adam Ozimek is chief economist at the Economic Innovation Group. Under his leadership, EIG has rigorously documented the flight of families with children from America's big cities. Daryl Fairweather is the chief economist of Redfin, where she's an enthusiastic advocate for land value taxation, as well as just a constant source of insight on, practical real estate market dynamics. And Alex Armlovich is a senior housing policy analyst here at Niskanen. His research translates urban economics into actionable policy research on the creation of abundant and affordable housing of all kinds. So the panelists have promised to be succinct. We're going to do some Q&A. today. So please place your questions in the question box that's in the Zoom screen. And with that said, let's get to the panel. So Adam, I mean, you're, I think, really one of the leading theorists in this whole space. And can you just help sort of explain, like, what's remote work versus hybrid work, and why does the difference matter?
Yeah, it's an important distinction. I think a lot of the discussion focuses on the impact on firms and individuals of hybrid versus remote, but there's a tremendous place-based effect as well, I would argue. So fully remote, means that you are rarely, if ever, coming into the office. There's obviously a gray line here. If you have to come in once a quarter, is that fully remote or is that hybrid? What if you go down to once a month? So there's not a harsh divide, but the farther you go towards really being fully distributed, that almost all the interactions you have with your colleagues are remote, that's fully remote. And then hybrid means you come in a few days a week. The implications for geography really have a lot to do with, how far away from your job can you live? If you're hybrid, the effect on a city of that is that the commuting zone expands, right? So if you think of like an hour as the maximum reasonable commute time for a job pre-pandemic, that's 5 days a week that you're willing to drive an hour. Now, if you only have to go to the office 2 days a week, what happens to the maximum commute time goes up, right? You're willing to spend a longer time in the car, so that, or on the train or whatever. So that effectively increases the commuting zone area. And that means employers in that area have more workers they can choose from, and workers in that area have more places to live that they can choose from. And it should change the gradient of house values, where the dense core becomes relatively less competitive, the exurbs become more competitive. And so you have the house price gradient kind of equalizes a bit. And we've seen a substantial amount of that. Fully remote work, though, means you can work anywhere. You're totally disconnected from the geography of your employer, or perhaps you're just limited to a time zone or being near a time zone. This has the potential to benefit places that don't have commuting access to large metro areas, where that might be way out there, 3 hours from New York City or something like that. So the fully remote has the potential to more fully disperse people throughout the country and to benefit smaller places that don't have any sort of agglomeration, that don't fall in the commuting zones of even our new larger commuting zones. So how much happens is going to have major implications for where people live.
Thank you. And I think obviously we've seen an increase in both of those things happening now. It's not, necessarily an either or, but this shifting pattern of demand, has meant that some places are experiencing a reduction in their relative values. Other places are seeing incredible pressure, as prices have accelerated a lot. Daryl, I know, land value taxation is an idea you've spoken about. It's sort of popular among a certain, internet subculture. But is this something that could help places as they deal with these kind of shifting winds of demand?
I think so. I think it can help a lot for areas that are seeing an influx of migration, and also help places that are seeing an exodus of people because of improper land policy. This really hits home for me because I'm one of these people in the second group that Adam spoke about that moved metros during the pandemic. I started off in Seattle, going into the office every weekday for Redfin. But it felt like every year that I was in Seattle, the city just kept getting lower and lower quality of life. So when I first moved there, it would take me a half hour by bus to get from West Seattle to South Lake Union. By the time I left, some days it would take 85 minutes by bus, and that's each way. So a lot of time just sitting with really just bad policy, because there's no reason that you couldn't have a better transit system in a city like Seattle. And a lot of it is due to the housing too, that a lot of the more affordable housing was on the outskirts, and then that requires longer commutes. And then when the traffic gets worse, it hits them harder. And then also Seattle was dealing with an increasing number of people living without shelter. So those problems just kept getting worse. And something like a land value tax, where land that is most valuable is developed, so there's more housing units, could have helped a city like Seattle. And now that I've moved to Wisconsin, I can see that this place that I'm in is starting to develop. There's more migrants in. We're about 90 minutes outside Chicago, an hour outside of Milwaukee. So a lot of people like me have moved to the area to be in group number 1 that Adam was talking about. And they're going to have to figure out how to build more housing and deal with more population growth. Luckily, there's time. It's not like a huge influx, and they're able to build enough housing, at least, so it's not, there's not a homelessness problem here yet. but it's going to be a problem in the future for these migration destinations if they don't get a hold of their land and housing policy.
Absolutely. So, Alex, you've argued that COVID, hybrid work aren't going to doom America's big cities, and you say that even in some ways, hybrid work can be a bigger opportunity for the biggest cities that have the worst commuting problems. And can you lay that out? How does that work?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's basically like the idea here is that hybrid work can, and the important hinge here is can be a boon to big cities if we take advantage of this opportunity. So like the roads were full in America's mega cities, in America's highest wage cities. The roads were full, and at least in New York City, many of the subway lines were full or getting closer to full. And there was this idea that, oh my God, how are we going to grow when we don't have any policy to manage auto mobility other than growth controls, right? We refuse to do congestion pricing, refuse to do parking pricing, and then our transit system is inadequate. How are we ever going to allow the kind of growth that we need? And now suddenly, New York City's subway, for example, is not expected to get back to 80% of its 2019 levels until 2026. So like 20% of the New York City subway system is suddenly available and extended. Like hybrid work is carrying millions of daily trips. And I mean, this is more subway capacity than a multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure bill would have built in any reasonable amount of time. So in some ways, there's a huge windfall that we haven't tapped yet. And then the question is, will we tap it? And this is a spot where Adam and I actually agree a lot on the fact, and we have some different empathies, but I think it could set up from Adam's perspective, is like, will the cities have the governance to actually respond to this opportunity? And so, like in New York, the subway is back to 1990 levels, right? So it's like, that's bad, but you're not going to shut down the New York City subway system. Lots of people wrote it in 1990. No one was talking about shutting it down in 1990. There are transit systems that are in much more serious danger. And so you could ask, like, how low can ridership go and how are cities going to bridge it, sustainably? And I think there are real risks there, but that in the kind of 5 to 10 year horizon, just funneling in, ending growth controls in the walking catchment area of transit agencies could both save the transit agencies and basically end the housing crisis in the superstar cities. I mean, that would be absolutely incredible. The opportunity is there. The question is, will they seize it? And then again, like you said, where the commutes are worst, hybrid work helps. So like New York City, the tri-state area has the absolute worst commutes in the country. LA is next, DC is third. And the relative benefit for having to put up with a commute should be, slightly larger the worse your commute was to start. So that would be basically, those are those 2 points.
So, something I kind of want to put a pin in there to keep in mind is when people use the word cities, it's a slightly ambiguous term in English. And, I have a 7-year-old and he's always going in circles about this. He'll ask, like, is Washington, D.C. a big city? And I'll be like, yeah, it's a big city. And then he'll be like, well, is it then he'll name other cities and ask, like, how many people live in DC versus, live in San Francisco or live in Dallas. And the the core municipality of Washington, D.C. is actually quite small. It's about on a par with Nashville. When we say that it's a big city, what we mean is that it's the anchor jurisdiction for a very large metro area, right? So some of these changes could, for example, help the DC metro area grow by making it more viable to live in Leesburg or Gaithersburg or things like that, while still being a negative for the demand kind of in the core. So here, a question for everyone is, ever since the invention of the television, if not before, there've been kind of think pieces saying telecommunications are going to kill cities. And in the 90s, when the internet was new, there was a lot of prognostication that, like, we're not going to need offices, we're not going to need urban agglomeration. And that didn't pan out. And instead, we actually had a big sort of downtown living revival at that time because crime fell and it became more fashionable. So, with fully remote work happening, I mean, is the death of distance back, or is this like the same kind of overhyped cycle that we've had before? So I don't know. Take that first. You love the hype. Why is this time different?
I think we can already see it. If you ask business owners, if you ask managers, like how much remote are you planning on having long run? Like they're telling you that it's not going away. We're going to stay at really high elevated levels of remote work. So like simply based on what the companies are planning to do, it's going to stay high. And that's just the beginning because workers want more remote work than businesses are planning. So now you're going to have labor market competition that incentivizes firms to embrace remote. So I do think that the actual phenomenon is going to be, you know, sustainable and grow in the long run. I think that this definitely has implications for cities. You can see it in the prices already, and you can see it in the rents already, and you can see it in the migration patterns already. And you know, prices at least are supposed to be forward looking, right? And so there's like obviously some wackiness in the housing market right now that makes it hard to interpret prices literally, but like already all the indicators are pointing to changes in the valuation of being downtown. And even now with, you know, COVID protocols essentially gone and mayors begging everyone to come back, you still have office occupancy rates that are like, you know, 40-50%, or if you go to Texas, like 60%, like which is still really, really low. So, you know, I see what Alex is saying about the potential for an opportunity here, but I would say if you listen to the mayors, they don't seem to think that their transit ridership being way down is really a good thing. They would rather flip a switch and turn that off. So I think that that's also pretty suggestive here.
Yeah, Daryl. So what do you think about that? I mean, is this a real permanent new era?
I think so. Like the way I view it is that remote work, or the technology that enabled remote work, created a huge amount of economic surplus. And some people are really taking advantage of it right now, moving to places where there's better quality of life, lower housing prices, or closer to family, all that stuff. And it's just interesting because this technology wasn't really new. It was accumulating over time, but because of status quo bias, it wasn't being adopted. And then the pandemic hit and there was a huge shock. And there's some places that aren't going to benefit in the short term, but if policymakers figure out how to tap that surplus and then redistribute it, hopefully they won't lose out too much. But I think it would create it creates the opportunities for some like creative tax structures. Like New York is doing their congestion pricing. Maybe that will help with the remote workers that are now coming in more from farther away places. They're not taking the subway anymore, they're driving in. So I think cities can get creative, but they also have to worry about getting people a reason to come into the city, because if people don't want to go there, if there's not like great restaurants or great nightlife or a great social scene, then there's no point. Even if there is an office there, maybe they'll go work somewhere else that allows them to work remotely even more often.
Yeah, and I mean, Alex, I mean, to this point, I mean, isn't the kind of the elephant in the room for cities that they have all this commercial real estate that has now been devalued, and you know, that's just a huge challenge that they need to find a way to deal with?
I would say, like, I definitely think that adapting commercial real estate is going to be this is one thing that I think people are getting a grip on. I have heard some conversation about this. Electeds seem to be familiar. They're like, we know we need to do something. This is another thing where, like, I think the initial stats are kind of counterintuitive. New York City seems like it should be the worst hit, but its office vacancy is only up to like maybe 15-18%, which is what a normal healthy commercial real estate market looks like. Like Atlanta and Dallas, and they're all in the mid double digits because commercial leases, they tend to be a lot longer than residential leases, and so they have a lot more price stickiness and a lot more friction, and so their so-called natural rate of vacancy is a lot higher. But then, you know, so there's a kind of counterintuitive thing where it's some of the Sunbelt office markets that are single-use districts, they're in pretty serious trouble. That's harder to adapt. A lower Manhattan, for example, already has experience from the reaction to 9/11. Lower Manhattan was declining as an office market relative to Midtown, because Midtown is where the New Jersey Transit, Long Island Railroad, and Grand Central all can come together. So it was already declining for a long time. 9/11 was this not quite death blow, but it was a very serious blow. And, you know, then so they allowed 25,000 new housing units in Lower Manhattan. Now it's a kind of 24/7 neighborhood. That's the playbook that I think cities are going to have to be looking to. Is how do we do what Lower Manhattan did after 9/11, relieve residential growth controls downtown, allow that kind of use mixing?
Right. So that's I don't know, challenge and opportunity. So one thing, Daryl, that I know I've seen from looking at is just that there's been you could talk about like relative shifts in where there's demand for housing, but it also seems to me that there's just more demand for housing than there was before. People are spending more time at home. They want home offices. Maybe remote is an opportunity to like use a vacation home more. I mean, is that something that you guys have been seeing at least before mortgage rates went up?
Yes, during the pandemic when mortgage rates were at rock bottom, people were, and also because of the pandemic itself, people were looking for homes that were much bigger with more square footage, larger lots. I mean, this comes with moving to the suburbs or more rural areas that now all of a sudden you can afford your dream home where you can't even see your neighbors, whereas in the city, you'd have to probably settle for a townhome, assuming that there are townhomes zoned. But now that homes are so expensive and also mortgage rates on top of that, people are looking more for that more affordable starter home option. I mean, people are looking to get into the housing market any way they can, because for so long, I think people have seen their rents go up and home prices go up, and they just feel like the housing ladder is being pulled away from them. But now with higher mortgage rates, it's shifting more demand towards rent just out of necessity, and rentals are staying more stable. But yeah, back to your original point, the pandemic did cause an increase in demand for those larger homes, but now that's been scaled back just because of affordability issues.
Mm-hmm. But we've seen, I think Adam and I have talked offline about this before, and also just an increase in the number of households, right?
Oh, yes. Yeah, household formation. That's another great point. Just millennials, we've delayed some major decisions like buying a home, getting married, having kids, but it's just a delay. We're still going to go make those decisions. And during the pandemic, there was also a lot of household formation because of, again, the shock to the system, people making those big life decisions, and that's going to be sustained. We're expecting that wave, that tailwind of millennial demand to be around for like 7 more years. Then what happens with Gen Z, I think, is up in the air. I've seen some arguments that because Gen Z is smaller, that the housing shortage isn't as bad as we think, but demographics are a policy choice with immigration and all of that. I know you want 1 billion Americans, so we're gonna have to build a lot of homes to get all of them in here.
Yeah, that's well, that's a panel for another day. So a question that came in from Stefan Cinto, or I don't know how to say that. My last name's spelled weird too. So he's asking, does remote work reduce agglomeration effects? Does a city with 2 million people and 50% remote work have the same agglomeration effects as a city with 1 million people and 0% remote work? So I don't know, Adam, what's your read on that? I mean, what's the deal with agglomeration in a remote world?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think a lot of the value of agglomeration actually comes between firms. And so, again, the big question comes back to how are places going to adapt? And so this is something Arpit Gupta was telling me recently. It's really about third spaces. How do we create new places where people can interact with people in their occupations and their industries? And those between firm spillovers of being close to each other actually, I think, more important than the within firm spillovers in terms of agglomeration effects. So I think it's partly what does remote work look like? And I think in a lot of places and for a lot of people, it'll look like different kinds of working and not just working at home in your basement. In some sense, if you got a lot of people in your city to move to co-working spaces outside of traditional offices, that could actually be positive for aggregate agglomeration by generating the sorts of spillovers that lead to it.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is something that a lot of people don't like fully understand. I mean, obviously companies had people work in offices together for some reason that had something to do with collaboration. But the economics literature on agglomeration effects wasn't about people working in the same office together. It was about people, it's an old idea that, manufacturing industry is like not just one car company is in Detroit and people work in the factory because that's where the assembly line is. But the question was like, why are all the car companies in the same area? And the idea was that having people with expertise in the auto industry kind of knowing each other and able to switch jobs from place to place and able to have suppliers who might have shared relationships with multiple companies generated some value for them. I think it's always been a little more nebulous, like how that operates in a white collar, when it's not like a direct supplier relationship. But that becomes the question is like, do we still agglomerate within an industry, right? Or maybe we just we're on this panel here in virtual space, right? This is some kind of virtual agglomeration. I don't know, Alex, it's your panel. How are we doing this? Are we virtually agglomerating?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I mean, I agree. I think I see two things. I see both, what are the outside of firm agglomerative benefits here, and then also some preference sorting. And so those benefits that are accruing outside of the firm, one thing that's interesting, we see that this is well represented in our panel. I'm using remote work for a DC-based employer from Queens in New York City. Matt can work from anywhere, and he's lived at his house in DC, but also then does remote working vacations with his family. Adam has long used a kind of a premier outpost of Moody's and then his own work to live in one of America's great small cities. Pennsylvania is a champion of small city urbanism. So Adam's there in Lancaster, and then also Daryl, moving from a coastal superstar to Wisconsin. There's this mix of things. So on the one hand, I think there's digital agglomeration. Like Adam and I know each other through Twitter. It's like it was through full employment Twitter a long time ago that we became friendly, and I think that eventually it put you at the top of my list for this panel. And yet, so like on the one hand, I think digital agglomeration makes up for some. The other thing I think that's interesting is like I don't think that Niskanen would let me work remotely from, say, Anchorage. We're recruiting a little bit on the Northeast corridor. We have a team in Boston, we have a team in New York City, and then obviously we're DC based. Our office is right next to Union Station in DC. And part of that is about proximity to DC, but I also think that in the housing policy discussions, right? Like I'm in charge of our housing policy team. I can still be connected to national networks in this in person and virtually. And so I think that if I were to go to, even with Starlink, which would let me work, I could go to the Northwest Territories of Canada. But I think that there would be some decrement if I was not still proximate to where all the people are buzzing about the ideas, even outside my firm. So I'm curious and Adam and Daryl, anyone, if you want to react to that.
Yeah, when Matt was talking, when he was describing agglomeration, I heard a lot of different types of agglomeration. Like you talked about firms being able to share employees, which creates liquid labor markets, or firms being able to have the same suppliers nearby so that they're not, transporting parts all over the country. And then you talked about the worker productivity element, that when workers are together, they're somehow more productive than when they're dispersed. And then Adam brought up workers networking across industries or across firms, and maybe that's good for their own personal human capital if they're trying to advance in their career. All that's great, and I think it's important things to think about, but something I think that gets left out of the conversation is what are the personal benefits that you get from being in a certain area. Like I moved to Seattle just because there was a job there. I had no roots, no family. I had a couple of friends, but they were also transient, moving in and out. So when I left, I didn't have any roots there. There wasn't any reason to be there. So naturally, when the cost benefit analysis changed, it pushed me over the edge to move to somewhere where I did have more roots, more family, all of the things that make me personally happier. And I think that's made me better at my job too. Like if you are in an area where you're happier, I think that makes you a more productive employee. That's actually what I used to study when I was at Amazon, was the relationship between employee productivity and employee engagement. And there is a positive correlation that goes both ways. So in terms of causality. So I think that's important. I think it gets overlooked. I think people are happier with their careers now. I think it's probably going to spill over into them being more productive in other ways, like in their neighborhoods, in their society, starting their own companies, helping family members start companies. All of that, I think, are benefits that we're going to see over the years and for years to come.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, Matt Kahn has a great book on remote work, and it's really he brings a Chicago school perspective to it, and it really comes back to just allowing more choice, and we disconnect the decision of where to live from the decision of where to work. Now that brings so much more choice to where to live. You can maximize on. It's not about one thing. Like people will be like, well, aren't people just going to live where the amenities are nice, or aren't they just going to live in vacation towns? I think you have to look at agglomeration pull, the magnetic pull of agglomeration to certain superstar labor markets as being one force that is pulled against dozens of other things that people can weigh and matter. Whether that's family or natural amenities or just the weather, the kind of part of the country they want to live in. So I think of it as like letting 1,000 flowers bloom instead of the singular flower of labor market strength.
So Thomas Irwin had a question here that's good. He says, how do you think remote work will impact the downtowns of medium and small cities where there's been an influx of remote workers? Says, I'm in California, so I'm thinking about the boom in cities like Salt Lake City or Bozeman. And will those cities see more pressure to adopt sort of denser urban forms? Because, I mean, we clearly know like one thing that's happening is people have moved to small cities that have high quality natural amenities. I would say like Portland, Maine has been booming. A lot of small Mountain West cities. People go there because they're nice places to live. Prices have really kind of soared. And I know a lot of local people, I mean, we might say as like technocrats, like, okay, X place is benefiting from remote work because a lot of people are moving there. But people who've been living there don't necessarily experience it as a benefit. To have lots of new people coming in, and what kind of pressures do you think those places are going to face, Alex?
I definitely think that there's a new pressure, and that it really is an opportunity. It's being experienced as a disaster in terms of housing affordability. Like Montana only has a couple thousand housing units. I had the number actually before, but it's something like you only need even with a 10% vacancy rate, they only had maybe 50,000 vacant units in the entire state. And so it doesn't take that many Californians moving to Montana to just completely fill every single vacant home, and suddenly you have a 0% vacancy rate, and it's just a disaster. But it is a growth opportunity. I mean, the joke about this is like you're like, well, Alex, before all this, you would have said that rezoning downtown was an opportunity, and in a sense, it is. It's almost like a cheat code. When there's a backlog of 400,000 units waiting to come in, you could just say, hey, click the yes button on thousands of units, and your problem is going to start to solve itself. And I think that's true whether you're talking about 400,000 units in New York City of this kind of simple estimate of the backlog, or this new backlog for living in a place like Montana or Salt Lake City. Obviously, there was already some tech agglomeration showing up in Salt Lake City before the pandemic. I have no doubt it is supercharged at this point.
And Salt Lake City, sorry, I was going to bring up in Salt Lake City, they have this climate crisis happening against their housing crisis, and they're facing a huge challenge there.
I mean, I just know that I've seen homelessness pop up as a problem in places that never used to have it, because there's been these localized surges in demand, and the lowest income residents of formerly quite cheap areas are now sort of outbid for housing. So we had an anonymous attendee who wants to know, will remote work enable a housing market correction? Are we in for a big repricing more generally? I'm gonna toss that to Daryl. What should we all, give us all, professional investment advice that we can take to the bank and make tons of money off of?
If people were moving to the place, so a little bit, people are leaving the places where housing is most scarce and they're most expensive, like San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York to a certain extent. Some people are coming back to New York. They're mostly going to Sunbelt cities. Now in the Sunbelt, it's a lot easier to build than it is on the coast. So they're able to absorb that demand better than these coastal cities would have been able to, or had been able to. So that in a way kind of reduces the pressure on home prices at a national level. Ideally, it would have been nice if people moved to the Midwest, where there's actually an abundance of housing, but people really prefer the warm winters. They hate the cold winters. And that may lead to more problems over time, again, with the climate crisis and the drought and hurricanes and all of that. Florida was a huge migration destination during the pandemic. But, in the short term, at least, it's easy to build in those places. But there might be some longer term consequences.
Yeah. So Eric Bagwell says, so much of this discussion, it seems, is focused on people who are beginning or in the midst of family formation. Curious about the implications for younger people, like recent college grads, Gen Z, and their preferences on relocation with hybrid or fully remote work for that demographic. So Adam, I wonder what you think about that, because yeah, I mean, I don't know, I'm 41, I'm a dad. I've always thought about this through sort of my personal lens, where there's like a yin and yang between, if you have kids, you don't necessarily like want to move and uproot them. But if you do want to move, it's like probably because you want like a big house, right? And that's like normal middle-aged person thinking. But what about young people who are, starting out in life, and it used to be, you left college and you would like go move where you could get a good job, but now you could maybe do whatever. And I find the idea of like even thinking about that kind of unstructured choice set like panic-inducing.
Yeah, I think there's certain ways that the new remote work sort of era opens up possibilities for brand new weird ways of living in life, like the digital nomad who goes everywhere and just works remotely. And that's like something some people are going to do. I don't think it's going to be like the most popular route, but it's like, again, taking the Chicago school perspective, like expanding choice sets, right? New, different, weird ways of living. I think for other people, one of the things we're going to find is that cities have become more affordable, and cities remain a good place for young people to move. This was Richard Florida's prediction from the beginning, that New York City was just going to become younger. Like, especially you're looking at like New York, which is a place where the gap between like the replacement cost of a building and like the sale cost of a building, there's this massive rents, right? This is what you're talking about with land value tax. How do we get at that? Those rents are sort of like they provide shelter to the city, because in a lot of ways there's nothing wrong with New York that falling prices can't fix, right? If prices fall low enough, young people are going to move in. Like, it's a great place to meet people. There's lots of nice stuff to do. It's just that's a painful process for cities, especially city governments, the process of falling prices. So like, that doesn't mean it'll be pain-free, but I do think, it's, if you're a young person who wants to move to a big, expensive city, once we get on the other side of this crazy housing market, right, where like housing isn't cheap or available anywhere, like once we get on the other side of it, I think we'll find that the superstar cities are going to be a more affordable choice.
But so this becomes cities as a kind of as a consumption amenity, right, rather than a workplace amenity. Then, especially, I mean, yeah. I live in a city now, but like, especially when people are young, they like to live somewhere where there's like lots of nightlife, like lots of things to do, lots of people to meet, and that continues to be valuable, in some ways even more valuable to young people if they're not competing for housing with middle-aged people who are just there for commuting reasons.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
yeah, I was going to agree with that, but yeah. Oh yeah, that, like
expand.
The one thing that one thing is funny, that the commute dynamics they replicate themselves fractally, like over and over again in miniature, all the way down. That inside New York City, the land rent to travel time gradient to the subway, it was like the closer you are to the train, the closer you are to good jobs, the better. And so like both in the city and then with respect to every one subway stop, those gradients are all flattening. So there are parts of New York City that people are moving to that they never would have before. Like Ridgewood, Queens is this boom town next to Bushwick, but it's like, it's on the M, it's a local line. It takes 45 minutes to get to Midtown. But again, you only have to do it 3 days a week. Great. It has this beautiful housing stock, great restaurants, very interesting people, like, so you're seeing, a redistribution of opportunity inside the city also. And so it's an interesting story that you see at all these different scales, but then also that, about consumption. So on Twitter, this was very controversial. There was this crazy housing Twitter cycle about whether it was like immoral to say that living in cities is fun, because we're supposed to focus only on the production amenities. But if you go back and look at the Glazer papers on this and the other academic econ, they're like the production and consumption amenities. It's like live theater works only at the highest scale. Like there are all these ultra niche specialized goods and services that are inherently metropolitan. and that living in a distant Sunbelt exurb can lead you to kind of like the end of history for consumption. Like once you bought a 70-inch TV and you have all the durable consumer durables, it's like you can only buy a nicer vacuum so many times. And then you're like, what am I going to do with my, if I'm saying for the upper middle class, you reach a point where a Sunbelt exurb just doesn't, a core is going to give you more consumption opportunities. And so I think that, yeah, absolutely. We're going to see some preference sorting where people who like cities for those consumption amenities, that's going to be a bulwark for the best car light urbanist kind of lifestyles. That'll be a small bulwark for downtown living a little bit.
Right. I mean, well, and I think that speaks to what Adam was saying about, the choice set kind of expanding, right? People who have a taste for city living will have a greater opportunity for it, and people who don't will have a greater opportunity to just kind of live someplace that's more affordable or perhaps more convenient. An anonymous attendee wants to know, how does the transition to remote or hybrid work affect the redevelopment and building of additional units in cities? Will developers keep building, or is there going to be a drop off in development projects? And so I wonder what you're seeing, Daryl, on the kind of construction front. I mean, a lot of different things, obviously impact the pace of home building and investment in this, but are we seeing people giving up on building in down? Are people giving up on building in cities?
Well, in the very short run, building has become very expensive because of labor shortages, material shortages, rising interest rates. So building is just like not where it should be. And another hurdle is land tax or property tax, that the incentives aren't really there for land to be developed. And I think in the last couple of responses, there was a little bit of over optimism about people's ability, or about the adjustment to these new costs and benefits. Because I think that because of property tax structure in places like California, people aren't really in real time feeling this adjustment in preferences that's been happening at a macro level. Like if you've always had the same home with the same fixed mortgage rate, same essentially fixed property taxes, like if you don't want to move, you're not going to move. There's no pressure on you to do that, even if there are all these young people who would love to pay more, not only for the home, but higher property taxes, or land value taxes rather, for the privilege of living in the city. There's not going to be this adjustment as quickly as we would like to see. And that also reduces building, because like those single family plots could be redeveloped into multifamily homes, especially now with the new policies in California. They won't even need many parking requirements if they're near transit, but that transition is going to be a lot slower if the people who own the land currently aren't really paying the full value, or aren't paying an appropriate cost for living there.
So I wonder
Commercial
if anyone
too,
had,
I would add.
yeah.
Like commercial property is going to have the same slow response because they've got long locked-in leases. Some of the developers are going to willing to sit on an empty building for a while, just hoping for prices to go back up. So I agree, it's going to be a slow process in a lot of places.
Do you guys have any thoughts on sort of types of development that might change or evolve? Because we've been, I don't know, you build houses expecting certain kinds of lifestyles. If people change how they live and the patterns of demand shift, it seems to me it stands to reason that there should be some alteration in terms of like what kinds of communities get built, as well as what kinds of communities people desire.
I'd expect to see like more senior living facilities with a lot of nice amenities that are kind of in their own enclave. You don't have to drive anywhere, fully walkable. Everything you need is right there. Because I mean, there's a huge baby boomer population that's going to be aging out. The single family home isn't ideal for them. They're too isolated. They're going to lose their ability to drive. And if there's not good public transit, they're not going to be able to take that. So I think that kind of dense housing will become increasingly popular.
Yeah, I'd love to see more big thinking from developers in terms of like, what is a remote work community look like, especially when we're talking about places that like kind of haven't had a lot of new construction in a long time, but remote work opens up possibilities there. Places that where you can still buy 1,000 acres of land and build there. My favorite example is like the Poconos. The Poconos is 2.5 hour drive from New York City. That's not a bad commute if you only have to do it every other week, which is the case for a lot of people now. And you can still get 1,000 acres up there. And so what does 1,000 wooded acres as a brand new remote work community look like when you're catering to workers who have different preferences, different demographics than the existing population, and they have like totally new ways of working? And I think we've seen transportation affect the structure of housing in cities over time, whether it's the car or trains or buses and subways. And I think remote work has the potential to have the similar impact. I just haven't seen a lot on this yet happening.
Right. In terms of just kind of like master planning from the downtown. So William Dungan has an interesting question. He wants to know, what should Philadelphia be doing right now to get on track for a remote work future? He says, per Castle, we're stuck at 40% office occupancy, and I don't expect that to improve. So I think, Alex, I'll kick that to you, because this is sort of, I think this is like the hard question for city optimists, that with the very most expensive cities, you can say, well, look, it's like you find a new baseline and you kind of go from there. But Philadelphia is a place that 4 years ago, the Philadelphia boosters would have said, look, like we have these great urban amenities, but it's so much cheaper than New York. But some of the same positive qualities, like everybody should come move here. But now their office district is kind of vacant. Their local housing demand has taken a hit. And like, what can they do?
There's a bunch of interconnecting points there. My old line on Philadelphia was, Philadelphia, so close to New York, so far from God, just like it was doomed by, like, a startup would start and its funders would say, why don't you just move to, Silicon Alley and Union Square? Like it was always like, just come closer to the VC. And likewise, like if you had urbanist preferences, you might be, you'd be drawn, either by the mix of incomes. There was still an income premium if you're for certain skill levels. And then it was mostly for, like, if you were a working class urbanist, then Philadelphia was like the golden opportunity. But that, yeah, like you would expect this idea that the filtering question for remote work is, if you ever ask yourself, if you said, this place is such a great place to live, but how am I going to get to work? That's the place that should benefit from remote work, right? And Philly has elements of that. And you are seeing, they did have, they had a permitting boom recently. And you are seeing still some there are inflows of young people. It'll be interesting to see the net movement of families. But these other interlocking pieces, if they don't get the fiscal transition, right? Like Philadelphia is a very poor city, and their budget is already fragile. And so if they can't stick the dismount of this transition of downtown revenues, and they're reliant on a wage tax, even though they have, Pennsylvania is one of the few states that constitutionally provides for split rate land value taxation. It should be a slam dunk. Instead, they have these much more distortionary local taxes. That it's like, if Philly could navigate kind of their urban service quality and this, like, transition through this rocky fiscal road they're going to get through, and stop downzoning. That's the last part. Philadelphia is still in control of the downzoners. They just downzoned the Girard Ave. There's a bunch of their council is still all both not just NIMBY, but they're NIMBYs who are winning. And so those are the three things that Philly has to transition to really make this an opportunity.
I guess, one way of putting this, right, is a remote world gives people more choices, and it intensifies the competition between different cities for where to go. So the penalty or reward for governance quality is probably just higher than it used to be, right? And everybody is going to be sort of wrestling with this. So I getting close to the end here, somebody asked, what about apartment development? Do you see changes in design or location of apartments due to hybrid work? I don't know if anyone here knows anything about this, but is it possible that you would build, like, I don't know, like an apartment building that was also a co-working facility, or any creative ideas out there that anyone has seen?
The one that comes to mind is the one that the WeWork founder was putting out there, Andrew Newman, which is, it sounds, the idea is actually not that bad, that you have a living facility that also has like co-working space and like yoga classes and a grocery store. Disneyland was also building something like this in California. I'm not sure who their target audience is. I couldn't tell if it was like old people or Disney millennials or what, but they're building like a inclusive place where, you live and work and eat and all of that stuff. So I think that could become more popular, and the one that Adam described earlier in the Poconos, that theoretical one, that sounds intriguing too.
Yeah, I think the demand for household formation that we're seeing, people should take that seriously as being a change parameter in household preferences. And that means more square footage. And so there's different ways to address that. You just build bigger apartments, right? Or apartments that are less suited for 3 roommates and more suited for like 1 person or 2 people in the office space. But the other way to address it is to create the co-working space integrated with the apartment building. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think it helps address some concerns that younger people have from remote working, which is like, well, what about the socialization aspect? You know, I don't want to be locked up in my apartment. And at the same time, they may not actually want all that apartment square footage to live in if it's just like, you know, because I'm going to be locked up at home all day or because I'm going to be co-working from home, I want it. I think that's really important stuff for people to be thinking through and experimenting with.
I do feel like if WeWork hadn't boomed and then crashed before the pandemic, people would be saying now, oh, the idea of like a place you can go that's not your house, that's going to have like fun hangout amenities, that this is probably like a lot of younger remote workers would probably like the opportunity to get out and meet some people and there'll be coffee on tap, right? And you could invent it. But if you propose it now, people are like, wait, wasn't that like a fake company that crashed and burned years ago?
It also kind of sounds like the Google campus, how, I mean, they were going to build housing right on their campus. I don't know if they're still going to do that, but that was one of their plans before the pandemic to address their housing problems for their employees. And then, yeah, it's like a company town, you live, work, eat there. But I guess now the company town, like the company doesn't need to be in the town. They can just create the town and then they can remote into whatever company they want, but kind of the same idea.
So, okay, so we're getting down here into some final round thoughts. So I want to ask everybody, what do you think is the most urgent question or issue that we need to understand to address the future of remote and hybrid work and its sort of impacts on housing? So start with you, Adam. What's the most urgent issue?
You know, when we talk about how many people are going to work remote long run, and we also talk about what are the sources of agglomeration in a remote economy, I think what's missing is the remote labor market, frankly. And that a huge source of agglomeration is the ability to match. You go to a worker and you move into a big city, there are so many more firms to match with, and that's really pro-productive. And if you're a firm, there's so many more workers to match with. There's so much potential there in remote labor markets for a greater scale of agglomeration than we've seen in any city in the world, if you think about a global digital labor market. And to the extent that that can be created and supportive institutions can be created there, because you do need new supportive institutions to make that work when you're trying to match across that many people across the world. That has a huge impact on how many people are going to choose to be fully remote, and therefore what is the economic geography of the United States. And so thinking through that, what are those institutions that need to exist? How does that labor market need to exist? What do we need to do to make it happen? That to me is the most important question right now.
Awesome. All right, Daryl, your candidate, most important issue.
I think going back to what we were talking about earlier, like making it so that people can react to these new conditions and do so in a seamless and frictionless way. Like I would actually love to see us giving tax breaks to people who are moving remotely so that they can increase their productivity even more in these new roles. And then I think transit is also a huge issue, making it so that people who have gone remote can get back in and out of the city easily on the days where there's going to be like those peak transit hours.
Interesting. All right, Alex, what are you thinking?
I like those recommendations, but I'd also add, I don't know the right mix between hybrid and remote, but I do know that you need to stop trying to fight workers on this. There are CEOs, there are especially downtown office building owners, and then there's some electeds that are trying to fight tooth and nail to just force people back into the office. And I think that's a disaster. The mayor of New York has mandated that people go back 5 days a week, and it has eviscerated the city workforce, as if believing that a single city could change something that is international in scope and technologically fundamental. And by fighting it, we're kind of damaging ourselves. It's like there is a way to fill up the trains, there is a way to fill up downtown, and that's by ending growth controls. So that's the most essential thing. Is like, you are right that there's a problem. You are wrong that fighting workers is the way to fix it. The right way is to build your way out of the problem and build on this opportunity.
All right, fantastic. So thank you so much, everybody in the audience, for coming. Thanks especially to the folks who asked questions. I want to thank our panelists here, Adam Azamek from Economic Innovation Group, Daryl Fairweather from Redfin, and of course, Alex Armlovich from the Niskanen Center. You know, this is a launch of a housing team that's going to be existing and doing more work at Niskanen. So I hope people who love this subject will follow the team's work. Niskanen Center is a website. It's also at Niskanen Center on all kinds of social media platforms. So you can find out all about what we're doing to sort of preserve a liberal democratic society with an effective government and free markets. So thank you all. This has been great. And I hope everyone has a good afternoon. Oh, last but not least, an email is going to come out soon after this panel that will have a link to the recording so you can share it with your friends, you know, spread this wisdom as far and wide as you can. Thank you all.